disc jockey drop the bass. Now the heads.
Passing the Tower of London, 5,000 fascists rally to their mobilisation for the much-advertised march through the East End. And Sir Oswald Mosley, black shirt leader, arrives at Royal Mint Street to inspect his followers. In Stepney, thousands of East Enders prepare to resist the invasion, barricading the path the fascists will take.
In light of some of the recent events and the punching of Richard Spencer and my comments about anti-violence and how you shouldn't just cold cock someone when they're limiting themselves just to speech, and being called a Nazi apologist for it, I was also asked my opinion on the Battle of Cable Street. The Battle of Cable Street was, and is, considered a pivotal moment in British working class rejection of the far right. In the lead up to World War II, as in many nations, we had a fascist movement, the British Union of Fascists, which was led by a man called Oswald Mosley, who had a fair bit of societal power and influence, a fair bit of political clout, at least to start with, and managed to garner a sizable enough following that he was able to lead a march of 5,000 black shirt supporters through London. And this was met with mass violence by socialist, anarchist, communist, pro-Jewish groups and so on to prevent the march, blockading the streets, throwing rotten vegetables and stones and stuff at them. It's commemorated with a plaque, and it's regarded by many people as this wonderful heroic moment for the left. And surely me, being a leftist, was proud of that. Seemed to be the implication of the argument. And therefore, why am I condemning the attack on Richard Spencer? Well, it's not really the same at all.
6,000 police are already concentrated in the area. Others are rushed to reinforce them. Communists, Labourites and Jews jam the fascist route, resisting the peaceful efforts of the outnumbered police to clear the way.
The actions against the British Union of Fascists, and specifically Cable Street, were taking place against a very different, though in some ways similar, context to the one in which we find ourselves. This was still the aftermath of the Great Depression. There were all manner of massive social problems. There was a genuinely full-on fascistic movement sweeping Europe, rather than this watered down. I mean, we have problems with the far right, we have problems with the right, but we don't genuinely have any fascistic groups with any genuine grip on politics or the populace at this point. I mean, consider the difference for one thing. Mosley was able to gather a group of 5,000 people for a march on a Jewish neighbourhood. Spencer was able to gather 200 Nazi light hipsters in a small hall. That's a huge difference. It's just not as popular, not as legitimate. And you risk making him more legitimate and more visible by attacking him. You also need to consider that street violence and so on had been going on across Europe, from Germany to Italy to anywhere else you care to mention. There was this massive amount of street violence, and a lot of it was provoked or started by communist and anarchist groups. So you need to consider that as well, that violence was expected, it was the norm internationally. And you also need to consider that at a previous meeting at Olympia, which had been reasonably peacefully protested up to a point, the fascists attacked the protesters. So this was in many ways a fight back against people who had initiated violence in the first place, and were likely to do so again in the minds of many people. So this was not an unprovoked attack. This was not an unprovoked attack on a helpless group that had shown no propensity for violence. It was a very different context. They were much more of a threat and had already initiated violence themselves at other meetings. So, very different.
Incensed by black shirt, anti-red, anti-Jew propaganda, 5 East End boroughs unsuccessfully petitioned the Home Office to forbid the march. Now the crowd take matters into their own hands. Mounted police come to their colleagues' help. Batons are drawn and heads broken as the anti-fascist demonstrators resist efforts to disperse them.
Now, my chief concern and worry with what has happened to Spencer and what has happened at 2 other far more mild right-wing figures who've held events and so on, the violence that's gone on there, is that this will increase sympathy for them. It will boost their appeal, it will make their opposition look bad. And that seems to be happening, and that's what the lesson of history tells us. After the Battle of Cable Street, the British Union of Fascists leapt in membership and interest. It went sky high. The violence on the street, the disruption, the suppression of their free speech created a huge amount of sympathy for the fascist movement in the UK immediately following that. Now, that actually had some positive knock-ons as well, in that the communist groups, the local government and others saw what had happened, that violence wasn't working, and they started making much greater efforts to relieve the deprivations and problems in these poor working class areas. They attacked high rents and so on, acted to provide and provision for people, to remove fascistic support that way by making people's lives better so they weren't so desperate. That sort of thing went on. But still, immediately following Cable Street, there was this huge leap in support for the fascists, because they were seen as being reasonable. They were seen as being the victims. Mosley called off the march. That was seen as a good move, a diplomatic capitulation that massively increased his sympathy. And this was at a time where their sympathy had otherwise been ebbing. Their support from the Daily Mail had faded away. The only way they had to get their message across was these mass meetings that Mosley was calling. They had no media outlets left to them otherwise at this point, because their views were considered so objectionable. But this street violence frightened and worried people and increased sympathy for the fascists. And this is exactly what we've seen occurring now, with the violence against Spencer, the shooting at the Milo speech, the riots and so on following the inauguration of Donald Trump. We've seen people increasingly shift to the right, become more worried about street battles and leftists and anarchists and so on. And this was a large part of what fed the fascist movement across Europe back in the 1930s, was the fear of communism, the fear of anarchy, the fear of street violence and the disruption of society. That's a huge part of what gave the fascists their appeal in the first place. So if we look to the lesson of history, we can see that that's the case. And if we look now, we can see that that's the case. Spencer's social media followers have doubled and doubled again following him being punched. This is a hugely counterproductive tactic, however heroic it may seem in the moment. I think discussing actual fascism is the one instance in which Godwin's law doesn't apply. So it is worth talking about Germany and what happened in Germany in the same period. So you had the same problems, but Germany being in much closer proximity to Russia, there was a great deal more paranoia and worry about communists and disruption to society and so on. And there was a lot of street violence by the left as well as the right. The right was seen by many people as an answer to the violence of the left, and that gave Hitler and his compatriots in the SA a great deal of public sympathy at the time, and this caused a panicked reaction, as you would expect. The government at the time did not like street violence. They didn't like the way in which people were putting on uniforms and so on, and they very much took the side against the Nazis and against the SA. And they moved to ban uniforms and so on following this violence. They moved to ban uniforms, they made certain groups illegal, they suppressed and repressed the Nazis following a lot of this violence. One of the big coups for the Nazis was being on the receiving end of violence. The shooting of Horst Wessel in particular led to a huge groundswell of support for them, and their anthem in fact. So all this violence was massively counterproductive to anyone who wanted to go against the Nazis, and it was against the background of these bannings, the bannings of uniforms, the bannings of organisations, the shootings and violence that the Nazis were on the receiving end, though they were of course dishing it out as well. It was against the background of all that, the repression of them by the government, the censorship of them, the silencing of them in any way you care to mention, that they gained so massively during the elections, because all of these actions created sympathy for them and made them seem like they were onto something, made the government seem like it was in the wrong. Combine that with all the fear, etc., that was going around, the poverty and so on. You can't ignore the background and aftermath of World War I and all that, of course, but it created a heady combination that essentially handed the Nazis power through public sympathy because of the violence. Hitler credited the street violence with being a massive factor in the rise of his party.
Fighting now spreads to the Mint. Sir Oswald Mosley was informed by the police commissioner, Sir Philip Game, in Trilby Hat, that to avert serious bloodshed, the march would ban.
So this is my concern, over and alongside the concern that just violence isn't a very good answer, except in reply to violence. Besides that, my concern is that these actions will further create support for these right-wing groups and figures. That's the lesson of history, that's what we're seeing happen now. And this is a more extreme version of the drum I've been banging for a long time about other problems. The unreasonableness of the left, because inverted commas, because I don't consider them to be the left. The unreasonableness of the left, the social justice warriors, the ardent feminists. Oh, and it's worth noting that Mosley learned a lot from the suffragettes. His wife was very active in the suffragettes. They were very pro their kind of tactics and so on. So, just worth as a side note noting that. But all the rhetoric and so on we've seen, the obsession with middle class, first world problems, the ignoring of the working class, all of these issues, that's what's led to this initial slide to the right, in my estimation and in the estimation of many other observers. Many of these problems that aren't even problems, the attempts to police and control people's speech, to police and control the internet, to no platform and ban, and to elevate offence to the status that blasphemy used to have until we overcame that. All of these problems that we've been banging on about for years have brought us to this point. And in what should be a time of reflection and understanding and grappling with the fact that this tactic has failed and finding a new way to go about things, instead we see people doubling down, we see things getting worse, we see an escalation to violence, and the response to that is in turn going to be more violence. So it's a counterproductive tactic. More violence, more sympathy for your enemy. It's not a good way to go about things if you genuinely want things to change for the better.
The car charges a black shirt crowd to get away. The incident rouses both sides. Blow all round. Minor injuries come thick and fast.
So, given this massively increased support for the black shirts, how is it that they didn't take over the UK, and how come we didn't become a fascist state? It's been interesting historically looking back, in that a lot of these revolutionary movements have thought that Britain would go along with them. Karl Marx thought that the communist revolution would start in the United Kingdom amongst the industrial working class, not amongst the relatively rural class in Russia. And perhaps if it had, things would have been very different in the world. Hitler thought that thought for a long time that Britain would be sympathetic to the Nazi cause, that it would go along with it or stay neutral or maybe even join the Axis in some way. There was support for Hitler amongst aspects of the aristocracy, aspects of the government. Some groups in the media and so on were sympathetic to start with. So given all of that, given Hitler's optimism about Britain's support, what is it that actually stopped the fascists taking over in the UK, or the UK being more sympathetic? Well, we had a more moderate approach to them than European governments did, where fascists did take over. We allowed them their speech, and in response to Cable Street, as I noted, people started to tackle the underlying social problems that were leading to support for the fascists. But that wasn't enough to stop them. What was enough to stop them was war. Once we were at war with Germany, once we were at war with fascists, once fascists were the enemy of the country, once they were an enemy in war, once people started to fight and die, national loyalties and international loyalties to the Allies took over from any sympathy for the fascists. And that's really what ultimately, finally killed any fascist support in the UK. That's how we beat them. Tackling the underlying issues and, unfortunately, going to war. I hope, even in the absence of war, we wouldn't have gone that way if that tackling of the issues, if that approach and British moderation had continued. Another interesting historical point to note is the state of affairs in America. Now, America suffered hugely from the Depression, but unlike the Germans and other powers in Europe in the aftermath of World War I, they've really had nobody to blame but themselves and their own institutions, and this did lead to a massive amount of reform and change. The basis of a more social society than had existed there before, a much less cutthroat society, and in many ways America has been sliding back from that social high point ever since. If you disagree, fight me in the comments. So what happened there? Why didn't fascism take hold in the States? After all, it was in many ways ripe for it, despite not having that external force to blame. Maybe it was more open to left-wing and communist revolt, and indeed it did shift to the left. But fascism never really particularly got anywhere. And why is that? What was the tactic used in the States? Well, the tactic used in the States wasn't so much street fighting and so on, though there were, of course, many famous incidents of fighting between, capitalists and corporates, strike breaking, that sort of thing. But what really happened in regard to the fascists was that they were attacked legally and socially. They were sued, they were attacked in the courts, they were beggared through the courts, and they were mercilessly mocked. Absolutely mercilessly. They were taken the piss out of at every opportunity. They were mocked, they were made to look ridiculous, and so they never managed to get a foothold. So a big part of that is the situation, but another part of that is the approach. Mockery. Mockery and beggaring.
Altogether, 84 rioters are taken into custody, while the police firmly prevent the battle from taking an uglier turn. 80 injured are taken to hospital. Hundreds more receive first aid on the spot.
So what can we learn from this historical example, and from it being borne out by what has happened in terms of sympathy and popularity for the right and the far right in the world today? Well, I think we can learn that doing your Captain America impression and punching a Nazi in the face is actually hugely counterproductive. We don't live in comic books. Sorry, I sometimes wish we did, but we don't. It doesn't work. It creates sympathy for your enemy. It makes it more likely that they'll be able to prosecute their agenda. It makes people more afraid of you than them, when it probably should be the reverse. So what can we do? Well, the lessons of history tell us what we can do. We can advocate for and tackle the issues of people who are genuinely deprived, and you need to do that cutting across the kind of boundaries that the far right and their equivalent on the far left are trying to do. So advocate for the poor, no matter their race, no matter their gender, no matter their disability, no matter their sexuality, no matter whatever. Advocate for things that will make a difference to everybody. Emphasize people's common humanity. The right wants to split people up on race. The left wants to split people up on race. I'm not doing the air quotes anymore, it's too tiring, it would happen forever. So tackle the issues and relentlessly mock the shit people. I mean, leading up to this, a lot of deserved mockery has been directed at the non-binary gender crowd, the black extremists like Ghazi, people like that, and they are eminently mockable. So the social justice warriors and so on are eminently mockable. And both neutral people such as myself and the right have made a great deal of hay by doing that mockery. Me in an attempt to warn you and get you to turn aside, them in an attempt to undermine you and take over politically, and they've succeeded. I didn't succeed, many of us didn't succeed in making you turn aside, and so here we are. So tackle the actual issues and mock the fascists in an effective way, mercilessly. I think Saturday Night Live has probably done more than any amount of protests and marches to undermine Trump, etc. Turn that same mocking eye on the Spencers of this world, on the white genocide purveyors, all those idiots. Just rip them to shreds so it's completely socially unacceptable. It's social suicide to be associated with these ideas, much as it's social suicide to be associated with SOCJUS ideas now. That's how you beat them. Unprovoked violence isn't justified, but fighting back, that's fine. I'm no Neville Chamberlain. I'm not saying capitulate to them. I'm saying use your voice against their voice, and if they're violent, use your violence against their violence. But just be wary that when you swing a fist, you're probably helping them out. Zang.
From impartial people, the police earn nothing but praise. So does Sir Philip Game in banning the march. Firm action by the Commissioner and his men undoubtedly averted bloodshed on a scale more terrible than London has ever witnessed.